By the time the blood had dried, everyone in the house had already decided she was harmless. That was how they liked their maids in the Valenti estate. Harmless. Small. Silent. Useful in the same way polished marble floors were useful, noticed only when dirty, appreciated only when they reflected power back upward. At 1:30 in the morning, the mansion was quiet again. Or at least, it pretended to be. The chandelier light in the grand hallway had been dimmed to a soft amber glow. Long shadows stretched across imported Italian tile. Somewhere in the west wing, an old grandfather clock counted time in a voice too dignified for a house with this much sin trapped inside its walls. And on her knees near the base of the marble staircase, Elena Mera was scrubbing blood out of grout with a wire brush and a bucket of bleach. No one had offered her gloves. No one ever did. The stain had already turned rust brown at the edges. It had splattered in a fond shape across the floor and lower balustrade, meaning the injury had happened standing up, close to the stairs, with force. Elena knew that not because she was curious. Because she noticed things. The angle. The volume. The drag marks. The way the men upstairs had laughed too loudly afterward. That was the thing about invisible women. They saw everything. Above her, voices echoed from the open doors of the upstairs gallery. Men's voices. Drup. Relaxed. Cruel in the lazy, expensive way cruelty became when it no longer feared consequence. Elena dipped the brush again, pressed harder, and kept her face empty. One of the men leaned over the railing. Still there, little ghost? The others laughed. Elena looked up just enough to be polite. Yes, sir. He grinned down at her, shirt collar open, whiskey glass in hand. Luca Valenti, second son of the Valenti family and a man who had inherited wealth, arrogance, and none of the discipline required to survive either. He was handsome in the way weak men often were, expensively assembled and spiritually hollow. You missed a spot, he said, pointing to a stain that no longer existed. More laughter. Elena lowered her eyes again. I'll take care of it. Of course you will. Another man stepped into view behind Luca. Matteo Riva, family lawyer, slick hair, red eyes, the kind of man who billed by the hour and betrayed by instinct. He looked down at Elena as if she were part of the floor. You know, Matteo said mildly, if she keeps staring at blood this much, she might finally faint. The men laughed again. Elena did not react. That was why they kept underestimating her. Because most people believed strength announced itself. They thought power was loud. Visible. They thought the most dangerous person in the room would always be the one with the gun, the title, the bodyguards, or the last name carved into the gate. They never looked twice at the maid with the mop. That had been Elena's first useful lesson. Her second had come years earlier, from a woman who had raised her without softness but not without love. If people insist on believing you are powerless, never interrupt them too early. So Elena kept scrubbing. Kept her head bowed. Kept the rhythm of someone who had no place in the room except beneath it. The blood on the floor tonight belonged to a man named Rico Santi. Mid-level runner. Unreliable. Too ambitious to stay loyal, too stupid to betray quietly. He had arrived at the estate at 11:48 with a split lip and a lie on his tongue. He had left 20 minutes later with 2 broken fingers, 3 missing teeth, and enough internal damage to ensure he would not be walking straight for weeks. Elena knew all of that because she had heard it. Because she had been in the service hallway with a linen cart when they dragged him past. Because men talked freely in front of women they considered furniture. And because, though none of them knew it yet, Rico's punishment had not come from Don Salvatore Valenti, the old patriarch upstairs. It had not come from Luca. It had not come from any of the laughing men in the gallery. It had come from her. 3 hours earlier, Elena had given the order from a secure phone in the pantry while pretending to inventory wine glasses. Not because she enjoyed violence. Not because she craved control. Because Rico had sold the route schedule of a protected witness to a rival syndicate for $80,000 and a weekend in Nice. And because one innocent woman and her 10-year-old son would already be dead if Elena had acted 2 hours later. Rico was alive because Elena had chosen mercy. That was the part the men upstairs would never understand. They thought blood on the floor meant someone powerful had acted. They were right. They were just wrong about who. Luca leaned farther over the railing, swaying slightly. You know what I like about her, he said to the others. No one answered because they already knew the game. What? She never asked questions. More laughter. Elena kept scrubbing. But inside, behind the stillness, she filed every word the way she filed everything. Not emotionally. Structurally. Luca liked women who did not ask questions because men like Luca feared answers. That was useful. Matteo spoke next, voice low and oily. You should be grateful, sweetheart. Most girls in your position don't get to work in a house this beautiful. Elena lifted the brush again and said the line she knew they expected. Yes, sir. Matteo smiled. There she is. There she is. As if they had conjured obedience out of her. As if compliance were proof of weakness and not simply patience in a room full of temporary men. Above them, a third voice entered the conversation. Older. Older. More dangerous. Enough. The laughter stopped almost instantly. Elena did not need to look up to know who had stepped into the gallery. Damien Valenti. The eldest son. Heir apparent. 38 years old, sharp face, broad-shouldered, and feared enough inside the family that people became more honest or more terrified when he entered a room. Sometimes both. Unlike Luca, Damien did not waste energy performing cruelty for amusement. That made him far more dangerous. He walked to the railing and looked down at Elena. For a second too long. Not like the others did. Not as a servant. As a variable. Elena felt it immediately. That attention. That intelligence. Damien Valenti was one of the few men in the house she considered potentially inconvenient. Not because he knew the truth. Because he was the kind of man who eventually noticed patterns. You're done when you're done, he said flatly to her. Not kind. Not cruel. Just final. Elena lowered her head. Yes, sir. He looked at Luca and Matteo without raising his voice. Go home. Luca made a face. We're just having a drink. You're drunk in my father's house after midnight. Damien's tone never changed. That wasn't a debate. Luca's jaw tightened. For 1 second, Elena thought he might push. Then he laughed too loudly, muttered something under his breath, and stepped away from the railing. Matteo followed. Within seconds, their footsteps retreated down the upstairs corridor. Silence returned. But Damien remained. Elena could feel him still there, watching from above. She kept scrubbing. Counted 7 seconds. Then 10. Then 15. At last, he spoke. You got all of it. She looked up. He wasn't leaning over the railing now. He stood straight, one hand resting lightly on the carved wood banister, his expression unreadable in the low gold light. Elena glanced at the floor. Almost. He nodded once. Then said, use peroxide first. Bleach sets some proteins deeper into the stone. Elena blinked. That she had not expected. Not the content. The fact that he knew. He must have seen the surprise flicker across her face because the corner of his mouth moved not into a smile, exactly, but into something aware of itself. My childhood was educational, he said. Then he turned and walked away. Elena stared at the empty gallery for a moment after he disappeared. That was new. And she disliked new. Because new meant unstable. Unstable meant attention. And attention was the one thing she could not afford. She lowered her head again and reached for the bucket. The water had gone pink. She changed it in silence, wrung out the rag, and went back to work. By the time she finished, the floor looked immaculate again. No stain. No evidence. No sign that a man had been beaten within an inch of his life in the hallway of one of the most powerful criminal families on the eastern seaboard. That, too, was a kind of violence. The kind that erased itself and called out order. Elena rose slowly, one hand pressing into her lower back for a second as she stood. She was 29 years old and looked younger if she kept her expression blank enough. Her plain black maid's dress hung loosely on her frame. Her dark hair was pinned back in a severe knot. Her face, stripped of makeup and softened by nothing except exhaustion, was easy to overlook. She had designed it that way. Nothing about her invited memory. Nothing about her demanded importance. No jewelry. No perfume. No opinions spoken aloud. Invisible women survived longest when they gave people nothing glamorous enough to resent. She gathered the bucket and brush, then pushed the cleaning cart toward the service corridor. As she passed the library, she heard voices again. Lower now. More control. The real conversations. Not the drunk laughter meant for performance. She slowed without appearing to. The library doors were half open. Inside, Don Salvatore Valenti sat in a wingback chair near the fire, one hand wrapped around a cane he no longer needed, but still used as theater. His silver hair gleamed in the warm light. His body had begun to betray him in the small, cruel ways age often did. Slower rising, heavier breath, one shoulder lower than the other, but his eyes remained intact. Ancient in the wrong ways. Damien stood across from him near the mantel. The old man was speaking. Too much softness in this house. Damien said nothing. Salvatore's jaw worked once. Your brother is weak. Matteo is a parasite. Half the men at my table are cowards in expensive suits. And still he tapped the cane once against the floor. Still I smell disobedience. Elena kept walking. Slowly. Silently. Invisible. Find it, Salvatore said. The words followed her into the corridor like a hand closing around the back of her neck. Before it reaches me. Elena did not stop moving. But behind her calm face, something sharpened. Because that was the first truly dangerous thing anyone had said all night. Not the blood. Not the laughter. Not the insults. The old man smelled disobedience. And he was right. He just had no idea it was the maid changing his sheets, polishing his silver, and cleaning his blood from the floor. Elena pushed the cart into the service elevator and let the doors close. Only when she was alone did she finally allow herself to exhale. Then she reached into the hidden seam beneath the linen shelf, pressed 2 fingers into the false panel she had installed 3 weeks earlier, and removed his small encrypted phone. The screen lit in her hand. One unread message. From a number that never saved under a name. She opened it. Only 6 words appeared on the screen. Phase 1 completed. Proceed to Phase 2. Elena stared at the message for a long second. Then she looked at her reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator wall. Amid a voice. A woman with bleach on her hands and someone else's blood under her fingernails. And beneath all of that, the one person in the house who could bring the Valenti Empire to its knees. She locked the phone, slid it back into the hidden compartment, and as the elevator descended toward the servants' quarters, Elena Marrow closed her eyes for just 1 second and prepared herself for the truth she had already known from the beginning. The blood on the floor tonight was only the beginning. Morning in the Valenti estate did not begin with sunlight. It began with performance. At precisely 8:30, the long dining table in the east wing filled with men who wore control-like tailored suits. Silverware gleamed. Crystal caught the light. Fresh orchids stood in the center as if beauty could disguise what had been decided in blood just hours before. Elena stood along the far wall with the other staff, hands folded, eyes lowered. Invisible. That was the rule. Not spoken, but enforced in 100 small ways. The maids did not speak unless spoken to. They did not look unless instructed. They did not exist beyond function. And yet Elena saw everything. Luca arrived late, sunglasses still on, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and poor decisions. He dropped into his chair with a smirk, as if last night had been entertainment rather than consequence. Matteo followed, already speaking into his phone about contracts and containment, his voice smooth enough to pass for legitimate if someone didn't listen too closely. Damien was already seated. Still. Watching. Elena felt it again, that awareness from the night before, not directed fully at her, but circling, measuring. Dangerous men didn't stare. They noticed. At the head of the table, Don Salvatore Valenti lifted his coffee cup with slow precision. The room quieted instantly. Rico Santi, the old man said, as if speaking of the weather, will recover. No one responded. That was not the intention. Silence stretched. Luca leaned back in his chair. He'll think twice next time. Salvatore's eyes moved to him. Told. No, he said softly, he won't think at all. The air shifted. Because that was not approval. That was correction. Matteo stepped in quickly, voice diplomatic. The message was delivered, Don Salvatore, perhaps discretion. Discretion, Salvatore interrupted, is knowing when to stop. His cane tapped once against the marble floor. And when not to begin? That line hung in the air like a blade. Elena didn't look up, but she felt the meaning. The old man wasn't satisfied. Not with the outcome. Not with the execution. Which meant something else was coming. Something sharper. Something final. Lucas scoffed lightly, too comfortable in his own protection. Next time, we'll make it cleaner. Salvador's gaze lingered on him a fraction too long. There will not be a next time, he said. Then he turned his attention away, as if Luca had already been dismissed from importance. That was how power worked in this house. Not raised voices. Not arguments. Just the quiet reordering of who mattered. And who didn't. Breakfast continued. Conversations shifted to shipments, alliances, a pending negotiation in Marseille. Names were spoken like currency. Deals were outlined between bites of fruit and sips of coffee. And through all of it, Elena listened. Not actively. Not obviously. But completely. Because information wasn't gathered in moments like these. It was absorbed. Pattern by pattern. Lie by lie. Then it happened. The moment she had been waiting for. Water, Lucas said lazily, not looking up. Elena stepped forward immediately. Yes, sir. She moved toward him with the glass, steady, precise. But as she reached his side, he shifted suddenly, too suddenly, and knocked his elbow against the base of the glass. Water spill. Across the table. Across his sleeve. Across the pristine white cloth. Lucas slammed his hand down. Are you blind? The room still. Every eye turned. Not because this was unusual. Because it was expected. Humiliation was part of the rhythm here. A ritual. And Elena was the safest target. She stepped back slightly. I'm sorry, sir. Her voice was soft. Controlled. Exactly what they wanted. Lucas stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. You ruin a $12,000 shirt and that's all you have to say? Elena lowered her eyes further. I'll replace it. The room shifted again. That was the wrong answer. Too direct. Too confident. Lucas smiled slowly. Truly. With what money? A few of the men chuckled. Matteo smirked. Salvador said nothing. Damien watched. Elena remained still. Silent. Because this wasn't about the shirt. It never was. Lucas stepped closer. Too close. Do you even understand where you are? He asked quietly. Elena met his gaze for the briefest fraction of a second. Then lowered it again. Yes, sir. Say it. It paused. This is the Valenti estate. And what does that mean? Elena let just enough hesitation enter her voice. That I serve here. Lucas smiled wider. There she is. There she is. As if obedience were something he had created. He leaned in slightly. Remember that. Elena nodded. Yes, sir. He stepped back, satisfied. Because men like Luca didn't want resistance. They wanted confirmation. Confirmation that the world was exactly as simple as they believed it to be. Power above. Silence below. He returned to his seat. The tension dissolved. Conversation resumed. And Elena stepped back into her place along the wall. Unremarkable once more. But something had changed. Not in the room. In her. Because now she knew exactly how far Luca would push. And how little it would take to make him fall. After breakfast, the house shifted into its daytime rhythm. Staff moved through corridors. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. Business resumed. Elena pushed her cart down the west hallway, her movements slow, methodical, unremarkable. Until she reached the private wing. She paused only long enough to check the corridor. Empty. Then she stepped inside. The room at the end of the hall belonged to Adrian Valenti. The youngest. 9 years old. The only person in the house who still asked questions. That alone made him dangerous. Elena knocked once. Tut. Come in, a small voice answered. She entered. Adrian sat on the floor near the window, building something complicated out of wooden pieces and quiet concentration. He looked up when she stepped inside. "You're late," he said. Elena allowed the smallest hint of a smile. "I had extra work this morning." He frowned slightly. "Blood again?" She paused. Most people would lie. They'll let protect. But Adrian already knew too much. Children like him always did. Yes. He went back to his structure. They should stop doing that. Elena crossed the room and began straightening the bed. They won't. Why not? She smoothed the sheets. Because they think they're right. Adrian considered that. Then said, very quietly, "Are they?" Elena stopped for a fraction of a second. Then continued, "No." That was the only answer she would ever give him. Because truth, when given early enough, became armor. Adrian nodded, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he looked at her again. "You don't look scared." Elena met his eyes. "I'm not." "What?" "Because I'm the reason most of them are still alive. Because I decide who gets hurt and who doesn't. Because this house belongs to me in ways none of them understand." But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she said, "Because being scared doesn't fix anything." Adrian accepted that. Children understood truth when it was simple. Better than adults ever did. He went back to building. Elena finished the room in silence. But before she left, he spoke again. "Are you going to leave?" The question hit deeper than it should have. She turned. "Why would I?" He didn't look up. "Everyone leaves eventually." Elena watched him for a long moment. Then said, "Not everyone." And for the first time since she had entered the house, she wasn't entirely sure that was a lie. By midday, the message came. Not through the phone. Not through texts. Through something older. More careful. Elena found it folded inside a stack of fresh linens in the service room. A single piece of paper. No signature. No handwriting she recognized. Just printed text. "Movement tonight. Final confirmation required." She read it once. Then again. Then burned it in a small metal bin used for waste disposal. Watched it curl into ash. This was faster than she had expected. Which meant one of two things. Either the plan was ahead of schedule, or someone inside the system had accelerated it. Neither option was safe. She finished her tasks. Maintained routine. Maintained invisibility. But by the time evening settled over the estate, something had shifted in the air. Not visibly. Not loudly. But then now. The kind of shift only someone paying attention would notice. More guards than usual. More closed doors. More quiet conversations that stopped when footsteps approached. Elena returned to the grand hallway just before midnight. The floor was clean now. Perfect. Untouched. As if nothing had ever happened. But she knew better. Because power didn't disappear. It just moved. And tonight, it was moving again. She set down her cart. Reached into the hidden seam beneath it. Pulled out the phone. Unlocked it. Typed only 3 words. "Proceed with caution." Zet. Then waited. 3 seconds. Why? The reply came. Too late. Elena's grip tightened. That wasn't part of the plan. That wasn't supposed to happen yet. Which meant something had gone wrong. Or someone had decided to move without her. And in a world like this, that wasn't just dangerous. That was deadly. From the far end of the hallway, footsteps echoed. Heavy. Fast. Elena slipped the phone away instantly. Lifted the mop. Lowered her head. Invisible again. But her pulse had changed. Because now, for the first time since she entered the Valenti estate, she wasn't controlling the board. And when control slipped, people died. The doors at the end of the hall burst open. Voices shouted. Men moved. And Elena Marrow realized something with cold, absolute clarity. The next move wouldn't be hers. But the consequences would it be? The first gunshot sounded like a door slamming in the wrong house. Sharp. Cliff. Violent enough to strip all pretense from the night. The second came less than a second later. then shouting, then running, then the unmistakable sound of panic trying to wear discipline and failing. Elena didn't flinch outwardly, but inside, every line of her body tightened at once. This was wrong. Not because violence in the Valenti estate was unusual. Because this violence was unscheduled, uncontrolled. She moved before the men at the far end of the hallway could reach her. Not running. Never running first. She pushed the cleaning cart sideways into the alcove beside the service corridor and lowered her head just as two guards rushed past, one barking into an earpiece. North wing, north wing, ooh, north wing. Her mind calculated instantly. Private family rooms. Study. Upper offices. Adrian's room. Her blood went cold. She turned sharply and headed the opposite direction, not toward the shouting, but through the narrow service passage that ran behind the walls and connected the private quarters to the staff stairwell. The old houses of powerful families were always built the same way. Luxury in front. Survival routes behind. The walls here had watched generations of lives. Tonight, they would watch one more. Elena moved fast now, her soft-soled shoes silent on the back corridor floor. The emergency sconces had activated, bathing the narrow passage in low amber light. Somewhere ahead, she heard another shot. Closer. Too close. She reached the hidden panel near Adrian's room and pushed it open from the inside. The panel swung inward. The nursery corridor beyond was empty. For half a second. Then a man rounded the corner. Not house security. Wrong bill. Wrong shoes. Wrong eyes. He wore a dark suit and gloves and carried a compact pistol low at his side with the casual certainty of someone who had already crossed the moral line hours ago. He saw Elena instantly and smiled. It was the kind of smile men gave when they believed the witness in front of them didn't count. Well, he said softly, wrong place. Elena looked exactly as she was supposed to look. A maid. A frightened woman in black with cleaning chemicals still faintly staining her cuffs. She stepped back once. Let fear show. Please, she whispered. He lifted the gun slightly. Unfortunate. He was going to shoot her. Not because she mattered. Because she was convenient. That was always the ugliest part. How easily some people decided a life was disposable if it interrupted the route. Elena's eyes flicked once to his wrists. Then to the hallway mirror behind him. Then back. He took one more step. And that was enough. She moved. Not dramatically. Not like in film. That. Precise. Her left hand caught his gun wrist and redirected the barrel toward the wall just as the shot fired, exploding plaster beside them. Her right palm struck the underside of his jaw hard enough to snap his head back. He staggered once in shock, more offended than injured, and she took the opening immediately. Elena drove her knee into the inside of his thigh, twisted his wrist outward, and forced the gun loose. It clattered across the floor. He swore and lunged for her. She pivoted. Used his momentum. Sent him shoulder first into the hallway table hard enough to crack the wood. He hit it with a grunt, disoriented but not down. Trained enough to recover. Dangerous enough to kill her if she made one mistake. His hand went for a knife this time. Of course it did. Men like him always carried a second certainty. Elena grabbed the nearest object without looking, a heavy brisk lamp from the side table, and brought it down across his forearm with brutal efficiency. Bone cracked. The knife dropped. He screamed. And before he could draw breath for a second one, Elena stepped in close and drove the edge of her hand hard into the side of his throat. He collapsed to his knees. Choking. Eyes wide. She caught the fallen pistol from the floor and leveled it at his face. The hallway went silent. For one suspended second, they stared at each other. And for the first time since he'd seen her, he understood. Not who she was. Not fully. But enough. Enough to know she was not what he thought. Enough to know the maid in front of him had just dismantled him in less than 8 seconds. Enough to be afraid. Good, Elena thought. Fear was often the first honest thing men like him ever felt. Who sent you? She asked. Her voice was calm. Let. Not trembling at all. His expression changed. Recognition. Then stubbornness. Then contempt. He spat blood at her shoe. Elena sighed once. Because of course he did. And before she could decide whether to break his hand or drag him into the service passage, a voice behind her said, "Drop it." She turned her head. Damien Valenti stood at the far end of the corridor with his own gun raised. His suit jacket was gone. White shirt open at the collar. One sleeve marked with blood that didn't appear to be his. And for the first time since she entered this house, he was looking at her without illusion. Not as a servant. Not as background. As a threat. As a fact. As a question he had not been prepared to ask. Elena did not lower the gun. Damien's gaze flicked once to the man on the floor. Then back to her. "I said," he repeated, quieter now, "drop it." The air between them tightened. This was the moment everything could fracture. Not because Damien would shoot immediately. Because once a truth became visible, it could never be made invisible again. Elena had spent 11 months inside this house building silence around herself like armor. And now she was standing in a private corridor with a gun in her hand over a fallen assassin while the heir to the Valenti Empire watched her with dawning comprehension. There would be no going back after this. The man on the floor made a choking sound and tried to shift. Without taking her eyes off Damien, Elena kicked the knife farther away. Then she lowered the gun. Not all the way. Just enough. Damien's expression didn't change. But something in him recalculated. "Adrian," Elena said, "where is he?" That hit him harder than it should have. Because she had not asked if he was all right. She had gone directly to the boy. Meaning she understood the danger. Meaning she had been thinking about the same thing he had. Damien answered instantly. "Safe room." She exhaled once. Still alive. Still reachable. Still useful to the future. Damien stepped closer. Slowly. Gun still in hand. "Who are you?" he asked. Elena looked at him. Really looked at him. And realized something inconvenient. He wasn't asking out of ego. He was asking because he had seen enough in the last 60 seconds to know the world beneath his feet was not what he had been told it was. That made him dangerous. But maybe not stupid. She said nothing. The assassin on the floor tried to crawl. Damien moved without looking and kicked him hard back onto his side. The man groaned. Damien's eyes stayed on Elena. "You're not staff." "I clean your house," she said. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting right now. That should have angered him. Instead, to her surprise, it almost amused him. Almost. Then the moment shattered. A voice shouted from the main hall. "Damien." Another guard. "Plh. Coming fast." Damien's gaze flicked toward the sound. Then back to her. 1 second. 2. Then he made a decision. He lowered his gun. Not completely. But enough. "Service stairs," he said. "Now." Elena didn't move. He looked at her like he was already out of patience. If there's more than one team in the house, this corridor won't hold. Move. That was not trust. But it was function. For now, function was enough. Elena bent, retrieved the assassin's phone from inside his jacket, and slipped it into her apron before Damien could object. Then she stepped backward toward the hidden service panel. Damien saw the motion. Saw where the panel was. Saw how naturally she used it. And his face changed again. Because that told him something else. She didn't just survive in this house. She knew it. Better than she should. Elena pushed the panel open. Before she disappeared inside, Damien said quietly, "You're going to explain this." She met his gaze. "Not tonight." Then she vanished into the wall. The service stairwell smelled like dust, bleach, and old stone. Elena descended quickly, one hand on the rail, mind moving faster than her body. This was a breach. A real one. Not an internal punishment. Not staged intimidation. An actual strike team inside the estate. That meant someone had greenlit open movement against the Valentis before Phase 2 had been properly sealed. Which meant either someone inside her network had jumped the order, or someone inside the Valenti structure had triggered a parallel operation. Neither possibility was survivable if handled badly. She reached the lower level and slipped into the old laundry annex unused at this hour, empty except for shelves of folded sheets and industrial washers humming in the dark. She locked the door behind her. Then she pulled out the assassin's phone. No passcode. Immature. Or arrogant. Usually the same thing. She opened the recent messages. One number repeated. No name. Only instructions. Window clear, north access unlocked, child secondary, priority is old man. Elena stared at the screen. Child secondary. Adrian had been a target. Not primary. But expendable enough to be listed. Her stomach turned to steel. She opened the next message. Internal confirmation received. Proceed. Internal confirmation. Someone inside the house had helped. Of course they had. These things always began from within. That this was bigger than Lucas' stupidity or Mateo's opportunism. This had architecture. Planning. And if someone had unlocked north access from the inside, then the betrayal wasn't only near the family. It was in the bones of the estate. A soft buzz sounded behind her. Her own encrypted phone. She took it out. One new message. Do not interfere further. No signature. No explanation. No greeting. Elena's face hardened. That was not advice. That was a warning. And only 3 people in the world would have dared send it. 2 were dead. Which left one? Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she typed back only 4 words. You moved without authorization. Sent. The reply came almost immediately. You're emotionally compromised. Elena laughed once. Quietly. Without humor. Because that was how men always described morality when an inconvenienced timing. Emotionally compromised. As if refusing to let a 9-year-old child get shot in his bedroom were some feminine lapse in strategic discipline. Her fingers moved again. You endangered the asset. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. The asset is the empire. Elena stared at the screen. And there it was. The reason all empires eventually rotted. They always forgot what they were supposed to protect. People became numbers. Children became contingencies. Collateral became language. She locked the phone, slid it away, and made a decision she had not planned to make tonight. The operation had changed, which meant her loyalty had changed with it. No more divided structure. No more remote command. No more trusting anyone who called innocent blood acceptable loss. From this moment forward, she would finish it herself. A pounding sound hit the annex door. Hot. Twice. Then Damien's voice. Open it. Elena closed her eyes for half a second. Of course. She unlocked the door. He stepped inside immediately and shut it behind him. The room suddenly felt smaller with him in it. Not because he was loud. Because he carried pressure. His shirt sleeve was still bloodstained. There was a shallow cut near his jaw now she hadn't noticed before. His gun remained in his hand, though lowered. He looked around the room once. Then at her. You disappear into walls often? Elena didn't answer. His gaze moved to the phones in her hand. Then back to her face. I asked you a question. And I declined. Something flickered in his expression. Not anger. Recognition. Because he had spent his whole life around women who softened themselves around male authority. And Elena wasn't doing it. No, now. Not anymore. He stepped closer. 3 men are dead in my father's house tonight. Elena held his gaze. One tried to kill me. That's not the part I'm confused about. No, she thought, it wouldn't be. He exhaled sharply through his nose. Then, more quietly, you took down a trained shooter in a corridor with a lamp. Yes. His eyes narrowed. Who trained you? She said nothing. Wrong answer. But not because he didn't deserve truth. Because truth in the wrong sequence got people buried. Damien looked at her for a long second. Then asked the one question she hadn't expected. Are you here to kill us? Elena blinked. Because there it was. The central fear. The only one that mattered. She answered honestly. No. He studied her face. searching for the lie, finding none. That changed something. Not enough. That's something. Then he asked, "Are you the reason Rico lived?" Silence. Damien watched her. And slowly, impossibly, understanding began to move behind his eyes. Not full understanding. Just the first crack. The first terrible possibility. Elena could have denied it. Should have. Instead, she said, "Your family has enemies because it mistakes fear for loyalty." He went very still. That wasn't an answer either. It's the only useful one. The silence between them deepened. And in that silence, Damien Valenier, enforcer, son of a feared empire, looked at the maid in front of him and realized something that would change everything. She was not near the center of the storm. She was the storm. Not publicly. Not obviously. But structurally. Morally. Strategically. And for the first time in his life, he did not know whether to stop her or follow where she was pointing. The house alarms began blaring then. A brutal mechanical scream through the lower corridors. Both of them turned instantly. Elena's blood went cold. That alarm only triggered for one thing. Vault breach. Which meant whoever had entered the house tonight had not only come to kill, they had come to take. And if they reached the archives in the lower vault, the entire Valenti Empire would not just bleed. It would collapse. Elena looked at Damien. He looked at her. And in that one electric second, with trust impossible and time gone, they both understood the same thing. They needed each other. Just for tonight. Just long enough to survive the next move. Damien lifted his gun. "Vault level," he said. Elena grabbed the brass keyring from the wall and slipped the assassin's phone into her apron. "Stay behind me," she said. He actually laughed once. What? Disbelieving. Then his eyes hardened. Not a chance. And together, the heir and the maid no one had ever really seen ran toward the part of the house where the Empire kept its secrets. The vault level was not marked on any blueprint. That was the first lie the Valenti estate told the outside world. The second was that it was only a house. Beneath the polished floors, beneath the wine cellars and hidden passageways and imported stone, there was another structure entirely, one built not for living, but for preservation. Records. Leverage. Names. Proof. The real inheritance of every empire was never money. It was memory weaponized. And as Elena and Damien descended the final steel staircase toward the lower archive, the alarm still screaming through the walls, she knew with bone-deep certainty that if the wrong hands reached that room tonight, people far beyond this house would die. Not metaphorically. Not eventually. Actually. Judges. Witnesses. Children relocated under sealed identities. 2 politicians whose names had never once touched paper but whose signatures lived in duplicate ledgers down here. The Valentis had always kept insurance. Against enemies. Against allies. Against each other. It was ugly. And it was useful. Which was why someone had come for it. Damien hit the final landing first and shoved open the steel door. The corridor beyond was dark except for emergency red lighting that washed everything in the color of old wounds. Concrete walls. Utility pipes. 3 locked doors. 1 camera, already hanging dead from its mount. Elena saw it and swore under her breath. Someone cut feed. Damien looked at her sharply. "You know the system? Too late to pretend ignorance now." "I know enough." "That answer is getting old." "Then stop asking obvious questions." That should have irritated him. Instead, he just gave her a look that said later. And strangely, that was worse. Because later implied assumption. And assumption implied he already believed there would be one. They moved quickly down the corridor. Door 1, Armory. Locked, untouched. Door 2, Financial Archive. Lock blown. Door 3. The War Room. Still sealed. Elena's pulse changed. That mattered. Because if the financial room had been breached but the war room remained intact, then this was not random theft. It was targeted extraction. Someone knew exactly what they wanted. Damien checked the blown lock. Professional charge. Elena nodded. Fast team, in and out. He looked at her again. How do you know that? She crouched and touched the edge of the mel. The cut is clean, no overburn, they weren't improvising. He stared at her for one beat too long. Then said, "You're going to tell me who trained you. Not before you tell me why your family keeps leverage files on judges." That shut him up. For a second. Then he said, without defensiveness, "Because my father built loyalty the way old men build walls, with blackmail and fear." Elena looked up at him. That was unexpectedly honest. He met her gaze evenly. "I didn't say I was proud of it." That landed somewhere inconvenient. Because she had expected arrogance, deflection, not self-awareness. And the worst thing a person could be in the middle of a carefully built moral war was complicated. A metallic sound echoed from inside the breached archive. Both of them froze. Someone was still in there. Damien lifted his gun. Elena reached for the ring of subkeys clipped beneath the emergency panel. He looked at her. "What are you doing?" "Changing the room geometry." Before he could ask what that meant, she slid a narrow brass key into the maintenance override beside the archive door and twisted. Inside the walls, something heavy shifted. A low mechanical thud rolled beneath the floor. Then a second. Damien frowned. "What did you just do?" "Locked the inner corridor and sealed the north exit." His expression changed. "You can control the lower floor?" "Yeah." "Jesus Christ." "No," Elena said coldly, "just competent." And before he could respond, she shoved the archive door inward. The room beyond was large, windowless, and lined with fireproof cabinets and rolling file stacks under emergency red light. Papers had been dumped. Drawers yanked open. A laptop sat cracked on the floor. And near the far wall, one man in tactical black was trying to force open a secondary cabinet with a crowbar. He turned instantly at the sound. Saw them. Raised his weapon. Damien fired first. The shot exploded through the room. The man dropped behind the cabinet, bullets answering immediately, shattering glass and chewing sparks from the concrete wall. Elena hit the floor hard behind an overturned records cart. Damien ducked behind a steel cabinet opposite her. The gunfire stopped. For one breath. Then the man shouted, "Back off or I burn it all." Elena's eyes moved to the canister at his belt. Accelerant. Of course. If he couldn't extract, he'd erase. That was the contingency. Not theft. Sanitization. Someone wanted the archive gone. "Can you hit him?" Damien asked quietly from across the room. No clean angle. He swore under his breath. The man behind the cabinet shouted again. "You have 10 seconds. Elena's mind moved quickly. Layout. Distant. Blind spots. Weight of the cabinet. Trajectory of the canister. Then she saw it. The overhead suppression valve. Old system. Manual trigger line still exposed near the floor. She looked at Damien. His eyes were already on her. Watching. Waiting. Trusting her without saying the word. She hated how much that mattered. She held up 2 fingers. Then pointed left. Then up. His expression sharpened. He understood immediately. Really? Useful men were rare. She mouthed, 3. He nodded once. Elena counted silently. 1, 2, 3. She moved first, rolling out from behind the cart and grabbing the exposed suppression line with both hands. The gunman fired at her instantly. The bullet tore past her shoulder close enough to burn air. Damien rose at the same moment and fired twice from the opposite angle. The man ducked reflexively. That was all Elena needed. She yanked the suppression line downward with all her weight. The sealing system detonated. Not flames. Water. A violent industrial flood crashed from the overhead pipes in a freezing sheet, drenching the room instantly. The gunman shouted in shock. His accelerant canister slipped from his hand. Elena kicked the rolling cart forward into his knees hard enough to knock him sideways, and Damien closed the distance in 3 brutal strides and drove him face first into the cabinet. The gun skidded away. The man struggled once. Twice. Then Damien slammed his forearm across the back of his neck and pinned him hard against steel. "Who sent you?" Damien demanded. The man laughed. Even now. Water streaming down his face. Bloody teeth showing. That house is already dead. Elena stepped closer. The red emergency light washed her face in something almost inhuman. She looked at him and knew immediately. He was not Valenti internal muscle. Not freelance either. This was trained external acquisition. A cleanup arm. Someone who entered after decisions had already been made elsewhere. Who unlocked North access? She asked. The man's eyes shifted to her. Recognition flashed. Not personal. Operational. And that was worse. Because that meant he knew what she was. Or at least enough of it to matter. His smile changed. You, he said softly. Damien looked between them instantly. The room went still. The man kept staring at Elena. We were told there might be interference, he said. Didn't expect it to be you. Damien's grip on him tightened. Elena's face gave nothing away. But inside, everything sharpened. This was bad. Very bad. Because if field teams had been briefed about her as a possible variable, then the operation above her had already begun classifying her as active opposition. No more ambiguity. No more quiet command from the shadows. She had crossed the line officially. And once that happened, there was no safe exit. Damien heard it too. He looked at Elena with something darker now. Not suspicion exactly, but the realization that the truth about her was not small. Not personal. Systemic. He said quietly. What does he mean? The man laughed again. Ask your maid who signs the corrections. Damien's eyes snapped to Elena. The room seemed to lose all sound. Corrections. That word. That one dangerous, loaded word. Because in their world, a correction was not punishment. It was policy enforced through consequence. Controlled violence. Ordered discipline. Invisible authority. And now Damien Valenti was looking at her as if the entire architecture of the last year had just tilted under his feet. Elena stepped forward, took the fallen pistol from the floor, and pointed it directly at the man's face. His laughter stopped. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet enough to freeze blood. You have one chance to be useful. He swallowed. Still tried to smile. Wrong instinct. Or what? Elena tilted her head slightly. And for the first time since Damien had known her, she let the mask drop just enough. Not all the way. Just enough. Enough steel. Enough certainty. Enough command. So that when she answered, even Damien felt it. Or I stop being merciful. The man stared at her. Then, for the first time all night, he looked afraid. Really? She leaned closer. Who authorized the breach? His jaw worked once. Then twice. He looked at Damien. At the bun. At the locked room. At the woman in a maid's dress who was somehow more frightening than the armed heir beside her. And he broke. Not nobly. Not dramatically. Just predictably. Riva, he choked out. Matteo Riva. Damien went completely still. The man kept talking, words spilling now that survival had become possible. He opened access, said the old man was unstable, said internal fracture was already happening, said the records needed to disappear before federal review. Federal review. Elena's stomach turned. There it was. The bigger board. Not just family betrayal. Not just greed. A legal burn. Someone had prepared to collapse the empire and erase all liabilities before outside pressure could touch the structure. Matteo hadn't just been skimming. He'd been preparing succession through ruin. Damien's voice dropped into something lethal. Who else? The man hesitated. That was enough. Elena already knew. If Matteo had done this, he had not done it alone. There was only one person in the house vain enough, reckless enough, and stupid enough to help him believe he could survive the aftermath. Luca, she said. The man's silence confirmed it. Damien shut his eyes for 1 second. Not out of grief. Out of disgust. Then he opened them again and they were colder than before. Of course, he said. The intercom in the archive crackled suddenly. Static. Then a voice. Ill. To troll. Terrible. Don Salvador. Damien. Both of them looked up. Bring the maid, the old man said through the speaker. It paused. Then. Now. The line went dead. Silence followed. Damien looked at Elena slowly. She looked back. The old man knew. Not everything. But enough. Enough to summon. Enough to suspect. Enough to make the next hour potentially fatal. Damien exhaled once. Then asked, very quietly, "What are you?" It was not rhetorical now. Not angry. Not mocking. Just stripped of illusion. And Elena, soaked through in a black maid's dress, standing in a flooded archive with a gun in her hand and an empire cracking open around them, had reached the point where lies were becoming inefficient. So she answered him. Not fully, but honestly. I'm the reason this house is still standing. Damien stared at her. No laughter. No disbelief. Because something in him already knew it was true. She continued. And if you wanted to survive the next 12 hours. She lowered the gun. Met his eyes. You're going to listen to me before proof feels comfortable. That was the moment. The one everything hinged on. Because powerful men often listen too late. Only after bodies. Only after collapse. Only after evidence became impossible to deny. But Damien Valenti did something rare. He believed her before that. Not blindly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to matter. Enough to change the story. He gave one short nod. All right. Elena looked at him carefully. That single word might have saved both of them. Then she turned toward the sealed war room door. Because if Salvador had called for her directly, then the invisible phase of this war was over. And from here forward, she would no longer be allowed to remain just the maid. By the time they reached the upper level, the house no longer felt like a residence. It felt like a courtroom built by men who had never believed in innocence. Guards lined the hall outside Don Salvador's private study. Not the decorative kind used for intimidation. The real kind. Quiet. Or alert enough to know the estate had already crossed into something unrecoverable. No one stopped Damien when he approached. But every pair of eyes moved to Elena. The maid. Wet hair loosening at the nape of her neck. Black uniform clinging damply to her frame. No makeup. No title. No visible right to be anywhere near the center of this night. And yet she was the one being summoned. That alone was enough to make the corridor uneasy. Damien opened the study door without knocking. Inside, the room glowed with low lamplight and old authority. Dark wood paneling. Bookshelves. A fire burning low in the marble hearth. A massive desk positioned like a throne for a man who had spent his life making other people sit lower. Don Salvador Valenti stood near the window, one hand resting on his cane. He had changed jackets. Of course he had. Even collapse, in houses like this, required presentation. He turned slowly as they entered. His eyes went first to Damien, then to Elena, and remained there. No shock, no confusion. Only a long, cold recognition. Like a puzzle he had nearly solved and finally decided to stop pretending not to see. Leave us, he said. Damien didn't move. No. Salvador's gaze shifted to his son. That was not a request. Damien stepped farther into the room instead of backing away. Mateo opened the house, he said flatly. Luca helped. There was a strike team in the archive. 3 dead, 1 alive long enough to confirm it. The old man listened without visible reaction. Then his eyes returned to Elena. And her? The question landed in the room like a match near gasoline. Damien answered before Elena could. She's the only reason the archive still exists. Salvador absorbed that. Silently. Then gave the smallest nod toward the chair opposite the desk. As if he was speaking to Elena. Not kindly. Not politely. As one might address a witness. Or an executioner. Elena did not sit. The room went still. Damien looked at her. Then at his father. Salvador's mouth thinned almost imperceptibly. I don't repeat myself often. Elena met his gaze evenly. I don't take orders from men who already suspect the answer. For one suspended second, the room forgot how to breathe. Even Damien's face changed. Not because he thought she had gone too far. Because she had just done the one thing almost no one alive had ever done in this house. She had spoken to Don Salvador Valenti as if she were not beneath him. And somehow, the ceiling did not collapse. Salvador's fingers tightened once around the cane. Then very slowly he smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was recognition sharpened into respect against his will. There you are, he said quietly. Not the way Luca had said it. Not as ownership. As revelation. Elena said nothing. The old man studied her for a long moment. Then he asked, "How long?" She knew what he meant. How long had she been inside his house? How long had she been more than she appeared? How long had he been living under the illusion of total control while a woman in a maid's dress moved through his walls with her own chain of command? Elena answered simply, "Long enough." Salvador gave a rough exhale that might have been a laugh in a younger, less ruined man. "Who placed you here?" That she would not answer. Not because she was protecting a superior. Because there wasn't one anymore. Only the architecture of a system she had already begun dismantling. "I placed myself," she said. That was not fully true. But it was true enough now. The old man's eyes narrowed. Damien remained still at her side, saying nothing, but she could feel the change in the room every second he didn't interrupt. He was letting her speak. Letting her hold the center. Believing her before comfort. That mattered more than either of them wanted to admit. Salvador tapped the cane once against the floor. "Do you know what I hate most about betrayal?" Elena's expression didn't move. "It wastes time." That surprised a sound out of Damien. Not laughter exactly. But flows. Salvador ignored it. "What I hate," he said, "is that it usually comes from cowards who mistake access for strength." He began walking slowly around the desk. Old, but not weak. Never weak. Matteo was always a rat in polished shoes. Luca, he paused, disgust curling beneath the word. Luca was born soft. Damien's jaw shifted once. There was no defense there. Only agreement. Salvador stopped in front of Elena. Close enough now that the entire room seemed to narrow around the space between them. "And yet," the old man said softly, "neither of them concerns me as much as you do." That, finally, was honest. Because Matteo and Luca were predictable. Greedy men always were. But Elena represented something far more dangerous to a man like Salvador. Unmapped power. Moral power, perhaps worst of all. He looked at her as if he could strip truth from her by force of age alone. "You've been issuing corrections." It wasn't a question. Damien turned his head sharply toward her. Not because he didn't already suspect. Because hearing his father say it aloud made it real in a new way. Elena did not deny it. "Yes." Silence. Salvador's eyes darkened. "How many?" She answered without flinching. "Enough to keep your empire from eating itself faster than your enemies could." That landed. Hut. Damien stared at her now with full understanding beginning to settle into place. Not all the details. But the shape. The magnitude. The impact carrying the Salvador's voice dropped lower. "Who gave you that right?" Elena held his gaze. "No one." The fire cracked behind them. Outside the windows, rain had begun. Soft at first, then harder. A storm gathering at exactly the right moment, as if the night itself understood what was breaking open in this room. Elena took one slow breath. Then, because this was the line she had crossed the moment Adrian became secondary on someone else's target sheet, she told the truth in full enough shape to wound. "You built a structure that rewards fear, punishes honesty, and calls obedience loyalty," she said. No one moved. No one interrupted. You let weak men rise because they flattered power. You let parasites sit at your table because they knew how to sound useful. And every time someone decent inside your system hesitated to become cruel, you called them soft. Salvador's face did not change. But the room did. Because Damien was hearing this too. And worse, he was hearing that she was right. Elena stepped closer. Not aggressively. just enough to remove distance. And when you're you have to think that rough, she said it quietly. Somewhere there's I don't know that is how to love the bit of it was survival alone have directed. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. Truth spoken calmly in rooms built on intimidation had a violence all its own. And since none of the men in charge were willing to do it without ego, she looked him directly in the eye. The silence that followed was almost holy. Because there are moments when power hears the truth and knows, with humiliating precision, that it has no elegant answer. Damien broke it first. Not to defend his father. To ask the question that now mattered more than anything else. What? He was looking only at Elena now. And unlike Salvador, there was no accusation in it. Only the stunned need to understand. Elena turned to him. Because that answer belonged to him more than to the old man. Because innocent people were paying for your family's dysfunction, she said. Damien went still. She continued. Drivers, accountants, wives who knew nothing, children who happened to have the wrong last name, men too low in the structure to know what they were dying for. She thought of Rico. Of the witness and her son. Of Adrian asking if the men in this house were right. No empire deserves survival if it can only sustain itself by feeding on people who never chose it. That sentence entered the room and stayed there. Salvador looked away first. Only for a second. But Elena saw it. The old man had not built his life around guilt. But even he understood arithmetic. And somewhere inside him, perhaps too late to save much of anything, he knew she had named the one sin old power never forgave in itself. Weiss. He returned to his desk slowly. Zeth looked older than he had an hour ago. Not diminished. Just finally visible as mortal. He placed both hands atop the cane and said, after a long silence, What do you want? There it was. The real question. Not who are you? Not who sent you. Not how long. What do you want? Because once power realizes it cannot dismiss you, it immediately tries to negotiate. Elena had expected that. Prepared for it. But still, hearing it aloud changed something in the room. Because now she was no longer being tolerated. She was being taken seriously. She answered without hesitation. Mateo doesn't disappear quietly. Damien looked at her. She continued. Neither does Luca. Salvador's expression hardened slightly. You would make family business public? Elena's eyes did not move. I would make rot expensive. The old man absorbed that. Damien's jaw shifted once. Not in disagreement. In recognition. Because he saw it too now. If Mateo and Luca were handled the old way, silenced, buried, erased, the system that created them would survive untouched. And untouched systems always repeated themselves. Elena spoke again. You want this house to survive? She asked. Then the men who poisoned it lose more than comfort. They lose legitimacy. The word sat heavily in the room. Because legitimacy, not fear, was what old empires secretly valued most. The ability to continue existing without being questioned too loudly. Take that away, and even inherited power began to shake. Salvador looked at Damien. Not Elena. His son. And in that look, a lifetime of control passed silently between them. Then he asked the only thing left. Do you agree? Damien answered immediately. Yes. No hesitation. No performance. No waiting for safer proof. Just yet. And for the first time that night, Elena felt something she had not permitted herself in months. Relief. Small. Sure. Dangerous. Because being believed before collapse was one of the rarest mercies in the world. Salvador closed his eyes for one brief moment. Then opened them again. And when he looked at Elena this time, it was no longer as though she were a trespasser in the room. It was as though he were finally acknowledging that she had been part of the architecture all along. You will stay, he said. It was not framed as an order. More like a concession. Or a challenge. Elena shook her head once. No. The old man's brow lifted. She held his gaze. I'll finish this, she said, but I won't belong to it. That landed even deeper than the rest. Because men like Salvador understood possession. That acquisition. What they did not understand was the person who could stand at the center of power and still refuse to be absorbed by it. And that refusal, more than the guns, the blood, the strategy, or the secrets, was what made Elena truly dangerous. Salvador nodded once, a graveyard kind of nod. Then he looked at Damien. Bring them in. Damien didn't ask who. He already knew. So did Elena, Matteo, and Luca. To be publicly enough to matter, privately enough to control the first detonation. This was it. The point of no return. As Damien turned for the door, he paused beside Elena. Just for a second. His voice dropped low enough that only she could hear it. You could have left, he said. She looked at him. Yes. Why didn't you? That answer, too, came easily now. Because children live in this house. His face changed. Only slightly. But enough. Enough to tell her that for all his discipline, for all the blood and inherited hardness and practiced control, that answer had reached the one part of him still worth saving. He opened the door. And moments later, the guards dragged Matteo Riva and Luca Valenti into the room. Matteo still wore his polished lawyer's composure, though it was cracking now around the eyes. Luca looked furious first, then confused, then afraid. And when both men saw Elena standing beside Damien, dry-eyed and silent in her black maid's dress, their faces changed in exactly the same way. Not into guilt, into realization. The kind that arrived too late to help. Luca laughed first. A bad sign. Men laughed when the truth was too humiliating to process directly. This, he said, looking between them, this is the emergency? Matteo said nothing. But his face had gone pale. Because unlike Luca, Matteo understood systems. And the moment he saw Elena in that room, he knew exactly what had happened. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand the worst possible thing. He had not been outmaneuvered by Damien, or by Salvador, or by any visible rival. He had been undone by the woman he had never once considered worth noticing. Elena watched that realization land, and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just completion. Because some people did not need to be hated. They only needed to be seen clearly. Matteo looked directly at her. And in a voice suddenly stripped of all polish, he said, Ugh. Elena tilted her head slightly. Des. Luca looked between them. What the hell is this? Damien stepped forward. Cold now. Sorta. The end of your stupidity. And the room, at last, was ready to break.